A brief history of Lithuanian economy during the Interwar period and the Lithuanian gold myth is the topic of today's video. Now, Lithuania, as today, was a small country in interwar Europe, a continent plagued with hyperinflations at first, and then by the Great Depression, and also by the war. Lithuania came into being in 1918 when it declared itself independent democratic republic, but it did not had any sovereignty under German occupation in that year, and also it had no defined borders, and the currency adopted at first was the German Ostmark, which was pegged to the German Reichsmark. The next year, the Germans retreated and Lithuania started exercising some sovereignty over its lands. However, the country was soon invaded by the Bolshevik armies, and therefore its economic policy of orientation towards agricultural exports and land reform had to wait until it was implemented in most lands, but it began that year. Also, Lithuania at that point did not have any access to the sea. Later in that year, the Bolsheviks retreated, but there were two invasions simultaneously from the Polish and the White Russian army. And the next year, the Soviets counterattacked and signed a treaty with Lithuania, which finally specified its eastern border, granted its capital, Vilnius region, and also 2.5 tons of pure gold, which was to be the base for Lithuanian gold standard currency. However, Polish attacked the Bolsheviks again and invaded Lithuania too, took the Vilnius region, but that finally resulted in stabilization of Lithuanian borders. The next year, Lithuania had a border treaty with Latvia, which gave it a small access and insignificant access to the sea. And also hyperinflation hit the German currency back in their country. But because Lithuanian government used Ostmark at that moment, it was tied to the German currency, and therefore Lithuania became highly inflationary too, which resulted in establishment of national currency litas, with using the gold blocks acquired from Russia during the treaty. So litas became the gold standard currency, with all of the Lithuanian banknotes backed safely by specific amounts of gold in Lithuanian bank and also banks abroad. In 1923, Lithuania finally gave real access to the sea by annexing Klaipėda region, which was highly industrialized, and also because of its unfreezing seaport, it provided Lithuanian economy a great boost. And also the country managed to do the first national census, and here we can see the results of it. It's quite clear that Lithuania was still a highly agricultural country, even compared to the rest of Central and Eastern European countries, not even compared to the Northern and Western democracies. Now, the later years saw relative territorial stability. In 1924, also, Lithuania finally is thought to have reached the pre-war levels of economic development. But in 1929, as we all know, the Great Depression hit and Lithuania was not spared, as some people think. This is very well illustrated by the price index. As Lithuania was mainly agricultural export-oriented country, it suffered heavily from the agricultural price drop because the value of its exports went down. And because it stayed on the gold standard, it could not devalue its currency and therefore offset the drop in prices. Also later, though, in the fourth decade of the 20th century, Lithuania saw problems with the Nazis in Klaipėda region, or the Memel as Germans call it. And that resulted, of course, in economic pressures from Germany, mainly ban on its exports for a year or so. And then Lithuania also was forced to impose exchange controls, which in essence meant that Lithuania was not a gold standard currency anymore, because any citizen of the capital could not just go to the central bank and say, hey, I would like to change 100 litas banknote to 15 grams of gold. That became impossible. However, the years between 1929 and 39 saw rapid industrialization and also orientation towards processed meat exports to the UK, and also growth of so-called cooperatives, the state trade monopoly companies, which sought to make the trade of agricultural products even more efficient. Overall, Lithuania was an average country of the Central Europe. It was more developed than Poland, for example, or than Spain. An average Lithuanian was living similarly to an average Czechoslovakian, Greek, or Hungarian. And the people living in Klaipėda region were even better off, comparable to citizens of, let's say, Italy or Austria. Now, the Lithuanian gold myth is another interesting thing to touch upon, as it is commonly believed to have brought stability to Lithuania, but as we've seen from the agricultural prices graph, it did not. And that was the same with industrial and other kinds of prices, mainly because the gold standard operates in a stabilizing way only when most of the world countries, particularly the most important countries, are adhering to the gold standard. While Britain left it in 1931, other countries left it later on. Lithuania was one of the last ones to actually impose the exchange controls, which meant that it lost its competitive advantage that it had before. Its exports became more expensive abroad to countries that have dropped off gold, and also it restricted Lithuanian economic policy. It could not easily print money to finance, let's say, its recovery policies. What happened later in 1939, the Germans annexed the Klaipėda region and Lithuania lost its seaport. Later in that year, Germany and USSR invaded Poland, and USSR signed another treaty with Lithuania, which specified that Vilnius region is given back to Lithuania, at least a part of it, but with a gift of 20,000 Red Army troops, and also a lot of problems related to the war-devastated former Poland area. And in essence, that gift of Red Army troops eventually resulted in full-scale invasion of Lithuania by USSR next year in 1940. Also, the socialist puppet government was declared, which decided, unsurprisingly, to ask for admission to Soviet Union, and the nationalization of private enterprises began immediately, which meant that any businessman who was better off during the independence years now lost all of his business possessions. So Lithuania was finally annexed by USSR just 2 months later in August, and although it received some small territories in the east of the country, it also faced massive repressions from Soviet Union. However, the economy was still operating mostly under capitalist rules. Most land was still in private hands. The national currency was still circulating, so it only became fully absorbed into Soviet Union in 1941, economically at least. But you may ask, what happened to that mysterious Lithuanian gold? Well, luckily, it was not being kept in the country, it was being kept abroad in Sweden, in UK and France. So Sweden did recognize Lithuania's occupation and therefore transferred all the gold to the USSR upon its request. Initially, the UK refused, and later on it used that gold to clear debts with Soviet Union, while France never gave any part of Lithuanian gold to the USSR because it did not recognize the occupation. But after 1990, all the gold was safely returned to Lithuania, and we still do possess those amounts. So thank you for listening, and see you next time.